Ladies and gentlemen, the subject I now propose to consider with you is such a serious and important one, and is in a sense so disquieting that, like you, I would gladly turn to anyone who could proffer some information concerning it. Were he ever so young, were his ideas ever so improbable, provided that he were able, by the exercise of his own faculties, to furnish some satisfactory and sufficient explanation. It is just possible that he may have had the opportunity of hearing sound views expressed in reference to that vexed question of the future of our educational institutions, and that he may wish to repeat them to you. He may even have had distinguished teachers fully qualified to foretell what is to come, and, like the haruspices of Rome, able to do so after an inspection of the entrails of the present. Indeed, you yourselves may expect something of this kind from me. I happened once, in a strange but perfectly harmless circumstances, to overhear a conversation on this subject between two remarkable men, and the more striking points of the discussion, together with their manner of handling the theme, are so indelibly imprinted on my memory that, whenever I reflect on these matters, I invariably find myself falling into their grooves of thought. I cannot, however, profess to have the same courageous confidence which they displayed, both in their daring utterance of forbidden truths, and in that still more daring conception of the hopes with which they astonished me. It therefore seems to me to be in the highest degree important that a record of this conversation should be made, so that others might be incited to form a judgment concerning the striking views and conclusions it contains. And, to this end, I had special grounds for believing that I should do well to avail myself of the opportunity afforded by this course of lectures. I am well aware of the nature of the community to whose serious consideration I now wish to commend that conversation. I know it to be a community which is striving to educate and enlighten its members on a scale so magnificently out of proportion to its size that it must put all larger cities to shame. This being so, I presume I may take it for granted that in a quarter where so much is done for the things of which I wish to speak, people must also think a good deal about them. In my account of the conversation already mentioned, I shall be able to make myself completely understood only to those among my audience who will be able to guess what I can do no more than suggest, who will supply what I am compelled to omit, and who, above all, need but to be reminded, not taught. Listen, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, while I recount my harmless experience and the less harmless conversation between the two gentlemen who, so far, I have not named. Let us now imagine ourselves in the position of a young student, that is to say, in a position which, in our present age of bewildering movement and feverish excitability, has become an almost impossible one. It is necessary to have lived through it in order to believe that such careless self-lulling and comfortable indifference to the moment, or to time in general, are possible. In this condition I, and a friend about my own age, spent a year at the University of Bonn on the Rhine. It was a year which, in its complete lack of plans and projects for the future, seems almost like a dream to me now, a dream framed, as it were, by two periods of growth. We two remained quiet and peaceful, although we were surrounded by fellows who in the main were very differently disposed, and from time to time we experienced considerable difficulty in meeting and resisting the somewhat too pressing advances of the young men of our own age. Now, however, that I can look upon the stand we had to take against their opposing forces, I cannot help associating them in my mind with those checks we were wont to receive in our dreams, as, for instance, when we imagine we are able to fly and yet feel ourselves held back by some incomprehensible power. I and my friend had many reminiscences in common, and these dated from the period of our boyhoods upward. One of these I must relate to you, since it forms a sort of prelude to the harmless experience already mentioned. On the occasion of a certain journey up the Rhine, which we made together one summer, it happened that he and I independently conceived the very same plan at the very same hour on the same spot. And we were so struck by this unwonted coincidence that we determined to carry the plan out forthwith. We resolved to found a kind of small club which would consist of ourselves and a few friends, and the object of which would be to provide us with a stable and binding organization directing and adding interest to our creative impulses in art and literature. Or, to put it more plainly, each of us would be pledged to present an original piece of work to the club once a month, either a poem, a treatise, an architectural design, or a musical composition, upon which each of the others, in a friendly spirit, would have to pass free and unrestrained criticism. We thus hoped, by means of mutual correction, to be able both to stimulate and to chasten our creative impulses and, as a matter of fact, The success of the scheme was such that we have both always felt a sort of respectful attachment for the hour and the place at which it first took shape in our minds. This attachment was very soon transformed into a right, for we all agreed to go, whenever it was possible to do so, once a year to that lonely spot near Roland-sec, where on that summer's day, while sitting together lost in meditation, we were suddenly inspired by the same thought. Frankly speaking, the rules which were drawn up on the formation of the club were never very strictly observed. But owing to the very fact that we had many sins of omission on our conscience during our student year in Bonn, when we were once more on the banks of the Rhine, we firmly resolved not only to observe our rule, but also to gratify our feelings and our sense of gratitude for reverently visiting that spot near Roland-sec on the day appointed. It was, however, with some difficulty that we were able to carry our plans into execution, for on the very day we had selected for our excursion, the large and lively Students' Association, which always hindered us in our flights, did their utmost to put obstacles in our way and hold us back. Our association had organized a general holiday excursion to Roland-sec on the very day my friend and I had fixed upon, the object of the outing being to assemble all its members for the last time at the close of the half-year, and to send them home with pleasant recollections of their last hours together. The day was a glorious one. The weather was of the kind which, in our climate at least, only falls to our lot in late summer. Heaven and earth merged harmoniously with one another, and, glowing wondrously in the sunshine, autumn freshness blended with the blue expanse above. Arrayed in the bright fantastic garb in which, amid the gloomy fashions now reigning, students alone may indulge, we boarded a steamer which was gaily decorated in our honor, and hoisted our flag on its mast. From both banks of the river there came at intervals the sound of signal guns, fired, according to our orders, with the view of acquainting both our host in Roland-sec and the inhabitants in the neighborhood with our approach. I shall not speak of the noisy journey from the landing stage, through the excited and expectant little place, nor shall I refer to the esoteric jokes exchanged between ourselves. I also make no mention of a feast which became both wild and noisy, or of an extraordinary musical production in the execution of which, whether as soloists or as chorus, we all ultimately had to share, and which I, as the musical adviser of our club, had not only had to rehearse, but was then forced to conduct. Towards the end of this piece, which grew ever wilder and which was sung to even quicker time, I made a sign to my friend, and just as the last chord rang like a yell through the building, he and I vanished, leaving behind us a raging pandemonium. In a moment we were in the refreshing and breathless stillness of nature. The shadows were already lengthening. The sun still shone steadily, though it had sunk a great deal in the heavens, and from the green and glittering waves of the Rhine a cool breeze was wafted over our hot faces. Our solemn rite bound us only in so far as the latest hours of the day were concerned, and we therefore determined to employ the last moments of clear daylight by giving ourselves up to one of our many hobbies. At that time we were passionately fond of pistol shooting, and both of us in later years found the skill we had acquired as amateurs of great use in our military career. Our club servant happened to know the somewhat distant and elevated spot which we used as a range, and had carried our pistols there in advance. The spot lay near the upper border of the wood which covered the lesser heights behind Roland-sec. It was a small, uneven plateau, close to the place we had consecrated in memory of its associations. On a wooded slope alongside of our shooting range there was a small piece of ground which had been cleared of wood, and which made an ideal halting place. From it one could get a view of the Rhine over the tops of the trees and the brushwood, so that the beautiful, undulating lines of the Seven Mountains, and above all, the Drachenfels, bounded the horizon against the group of trees, while in the center of the bow formed the glistening Rhine itself. The island of Nonworth stood out, as it suspended in the river's arms. This was the place which had become sacred to us through the dreams and plans we had in common, and to which we intended to withdraw later in the evening. Nay, to which we should be obliged to withdraw, if we wished to close the day in accordance with the law we had imposed upon ourselves. At one end of the little uneven plateau, and not very far away, there stood the mighty trunk of an oak tree, prominently visible against a background quite bare of trees, and consisting merely of low, undulating hills in the distance. Working together, we had once carved a pentagram in the side of this tree trunk. Years of exposure to rain and storm had slightly deepened the channels we'd cut, and the figure seemed a welcome target for our pistol practice. It was already late in the afternoon when we reached our improvised range, and our oak stump cast a long, attenuated shadow across the barren heath. All was still. Thanks to the lofty trees at our feet, we were unable to catch a glimpse of the valley of the Rhine below. The peacefulness of the spot seemed only to intensify the loudness of our pistol shots, and I had scarcely fired my second barrel at the pentagram when I felt someone lay hold of my arm, and noticed that my friend had also someone beside him who had interrupted his loading. Turning sharply on my heels, I found myself face to face with an astonished old gentleman, and felt what must have been a very powerful dog make a lunge at my back. My friend had been approached by a somewhat younger man than I had, but before we could give expression to our surprise, the older of the two interlopers burst forth in the following threatening and heated strain. "No, no," he called to us. "No duels must be fought here, but least of all you young students fight one. Away with these pistols and compose yourself. Be reconciled, shake hands. What? And are you the salt of the earth, the intelligence of the future, the seed of our hopes? And are you not even able to emancipate yourselves from the insane code of honor and its violent regulations? I will not cast any aspirations on your heart, but your heads certainly do you no credit. You, whose youth is watched over by the wisdom of Greece and Rome, and whose youthful spirits, at the cost of enormous pains, have been flooded with the light of the sages and heroes of antiquity, can you not refrain from making the code of knightly honor, that is to say, the code of folly and brutality, the guiding principle of your conduct? Examine it rationally once and for all, and reduce it to plain terms. Lay its pitiable narrowness bare, and let it be the touchstone, not of your hearts, but of your minds. If you do not regret it then, it will merely show that your head is not fitted for work in a sphere where great gifts of discrimination are needful in order to burst the bonds of prejudice, and where a well-balanced understanding is necessary for the purpose of distinguishing right from wrong, even when the difference between them lies deeply hidden and is not, in this case, so ridiculously obvious. In that case, therefore, my lads, try to go through life in some other honorable manner. Join the army, learn a handicraft that pays its way." To this rough, though admittedly just, flood of eloquence, we replied with some irritation, interrupting each other continually in doing so. "In the first place, you are mistaken concerning the main point, for we are not here to fight a duel at all, but rather to practice pistol shooting. Secondly, you do not appear to know how a real duel is conducted. Do you suppose that we should have faced each other in this lonely spot, like two highwaymen, without seconds or doctors, etc.? Thirdly, with regard to the question of dueling, we each have our own opinions and do not require to be waylaid and surprised by the sort of instruction you may feel disposed to give us." This reply, which was certainly not polite, made a bad impression upon the old man. At first, when he heard that we were not about to fight a duel, he surveyed us more kindly, but when we reached the last passage of our speech, he seemed so vexed that he growled. When, however, we began to speak of our point of view, he quickly caught hold of his companion, turned sharply round, and cried to us in bitter tones, "People should not have points of view, but thoughts." And then his companion added, "Be respectful when a man such as this even makes mistakes." Meanwhile, my friend who had reloaded, fired a shot at the pentagram after having cried, "Look out!" The sudden report behind his back made the old man savage. Once more he turned round and looked sourly at my friend, after which he said to his companion in a feeble voice, "What shall we do? These young men will be the death of me with their firing." "You should know," said the younger man, turning to us, "that your noisy pastimes amount, as it happens on this occasion, to an attempt upon the life of philosophy. You observe this venerable man. He is in a position to beg you to desist from firing here, and when such a man begs—" "Well, his request is generally granted," the old man interjected, surveying us sternly. As a matter of fact, we did not know what to make of the whole matter. We could not understand what our noisy pastimes could have in common with philosophy, nor could we see why, out of regard for polite scruples, we should abandon our shooting range, and at this moment we may have appeared somewhat undecided and perturbed. The companion, noticing our momentary discomfiture, proceeded to explain the matter to us. "We are compelled," he said, "to linger in this immediate neighborhood for an hour or so. We have a rendezvous here. An eminent friend of this eminent man is to meet us here this evening, and we had actually selected this peaceful spot, with its few benches in the midst of the wood, for the meeting. It would really be most unpleasant if, owing to your continual pistol practice, we were to be subjected to an unending series of shocks. Surely your own feelings will tell you that it is impossible for you to continue your firing when you hear that he who has selected this quiet and isolated place for a meeting with a friend is one of our most eminent philosophers." This explanation only succeeded in perturbing us more, for we saw a danger threatening us which was even greater than the loss of our shooting range, and we asked eagerly, "Where is this quiet spot? Surely not to the left here in the wood." "That is the very place." "But this evening that place belongs to us," my friend interposed. "We must have it," we cried together. Our long-projected celebration seemed at that moment more important than all the philosophies of the world, and we gave such vehement and animated utterance to our sentiments that in view of the incomprehensible nature of our claims we must have cut a somewhat ridiculous figure. At any rate, our philosophical interlopers regarded us with expressions of amused inquiry, as if they expected us to proffer some sort of apology, but we were silent, for we wished above all to keep our secret. Thus we stood facing one another in silence, while the sunset dyed the tree-tops a ruddy gold. The philosopher contemplated the sun, his companion contemplated him, and we turned our eyes towards our nook in the woods, which today we seemed in such great danger of losing. A feeling of sullen anger took possession of us. What is philosophy, we asked ourselves, if it prevents a man from being by himself, or from enjoying the select company of a friend? In sooth, if it prevents him from being a philosopher, for we regarded the celebration of our right as a thoroughly philosophical performance. In celebrating it, we wished to form plans and resolutions for the future. By means of quiet reflections, we hoped to light upon an idea which would once again help us to form and gratify our spirit in the future, just as that former idea had done during our boyhood. The solemn act derived its very significance from this resolution, that nothing definite was to be done. We were only to be alone, and to sit still and meditate, as we had done 5 years before when we had each been inspired with the same thought. It was to be a silent solemnization, all reminiscence and all future. The present was to be a hyphen between the two, and fate, now unfriendly, had just stepped into our magic circle, and we knew not how to dismiss her. The very unusual character of the circumstances filled us with mysterious excitement. Whilst we stood thus in silence for some time, divided into two hostile groups, the clouds above waxed even redder, and the evening seemed to grow more peaceful and mild. We could almost fancy we heard the regular breathing of nature as she put the final touches to her work of art, the glorious day we had just enjoyed. When, suddenly, the calm evening air was rent by a confused and boisterous cry of joy which seemed to come from the Rhine. A number of voices could be heard in the distance. They were those of our fellow students, who by that time must have taken to the Rhine in small boats. It occurred to us that we should be missed, and that we should also miss something. Almost simultaneously, my friend and I raised our pistols. Our shots were echoed back to us, and with their echo there came from the valley the sound of a well-known cry intended as a signal of identification, for our passion for shooting had brought us both repute and ill repute in our club. At the same time, we were conscious that our behavior towards the silent philosophical couple had been exceptionally ungentlemanly. They had been quietly contemplating us for some time, and when we fired the shock made them draw close up to each other. We hurried up to them, and each in our turn cried out, "Forgive us! That was our last shot, and it was intended for our friends on the Rhine. They have understood us. Do you hear? If you insist upon having that place among the trees, grant us at least the permission to recline there also. You will find a number of benches on this spot. We shall not disturb you. We shall sit quite still and shall not utter a word. But it is now past 7 o'clock, and we must go there at once." "That sounds more mysterious than it is," I added after a pause. "We have made a solemn vow to spend this coming hour on that ground, and there were reasons for the vow. The spot is sacred to us, owing to some pleasant associations. It must also inaugurate a good future for us. We shall therefore endeavor to leave you with no disagreeable recollections of our meeting, even though we have done much to perturb and frighten you." The philosopher was silent. His companion, however, said, "Our promises and plans unfortunately compel us not only to remain, but also to spend the same hour on the spot you have selected. It is left for us to decide whether fate or perhaps a spirit has been responsible for this extraordinary coincidence." "Besides, my friend," said the philosopher, "I am not half so displeased with these warlike youngsters as I was. Did you observe how quiet they were a moment ago when we were contemplating the sun? They neither spoke nor smoked. They stood stone still. I believe they meditated." Turning suddenly our direction, he said, "Were you meditating? Just tell me about it as we proceed in the direction of our common trysting place." We took a few steps together and went down the slope into a warm, balmy air of the woods where it was already much darker. On the way, my friend openly revealed his thoughts to the philosopher. he confessed how much he had feared that perhaps today, for the first time, a philosopher was about to stand in the way of his philosophizing. The sage laughed. What? You were afraid a philosopher would prevent your philosophizing? This might easily happen, and you have not yet experienced such a thing? Has your university life been free from experience? You surely attend lectures on philosophy. The question discomfited us, for, as a matter of fact, there had been no element of philosophy in our education up to that time. In those days, moreover, we fondly imagined that everybody who held the post and possessed the dignity of a philosopher must perforce be one. We were inexperienced and badly informed. We frankly admitted that we had not yet belonged to any philosophical college, but that we would certainly make up for lost time. Then what, he asked, did you mean when you spoke of philosophizing? Said I. We were at a loss for a definition, but to all intents and purposes we meant this, that we wished to make earnest endeavors to consider the best possible means of becoming men of culture. That is a good deal, and at the same time very little, growled the philosopher. Just you think the matter over. Here are our benches. Let us discuss the question exhaustively. I shall not disturb your meditations with regard to how you are to become men of culture. I wish you success and points of view, as in your dueling questions. Brand new, original, and enlightening points of view. The philosopher does not wish to prevent your philosophizing, but refrain at least from disconcerting him with your pistol shots. Try to imitate the Pythagoreans today. They, as servants of true philosophy, had to remain silent for 5 years. Possibly you may also be able to remain silent for 5 minutes, 15 minutes, as servants of your own future culture, about which you seem so concerned. We had reached our destination. The solemnization of our rite began. As on the previous occasion 5 years ago, the Rhine was once more flowing beneath a light mist. The sky seemed bright, and the woods exhaled the same fragrance. We took our places on the farthest corner of the most distant bench. Sitting there we were almost concealed, and neither the philosopher nor his companion could see our faces. We were alone. When the sound of the philosopher's voice reached us, it had become so blended with the rustling leaves and with the buzzing murmur of the myriads of living things inhabiting the wooded height that it almost seemed like the music of nature. As a sound, it resembled nothing more than a distant, monotonous plaint. We were indeed undisturbed. Some time elapsed in this way, and while the glow of sunset grew steadily paler, the recollection of our youthful undertaking in the cause of culture waxed even more vivid. It seemed to us as if we had owed the greatest debt of gratitude to that little society we had founded, for it had done more than merely supplement our public school training. It had actually been the only fruitful society we had had, and within its frame we even placed our public school life as a purely isolated factor helping us in our general efforts to attain culture. We knew that, thanks to our little society, no thought of embracing any particular career had ever entered our mind in those days. The all too frequent exploitation of youth by the state for its own purposes, that is to say, so that it may rear useful officials as quickly as possible and guarantee their unconditional obedience to it by means of excessively severe examinations, had remained quite foreign to our education, and to show how little we had actuated by thoughts of utility, or by the prospect of speedy advancement and rapid success, on that day we were struck by the comforting consideration that, even then, we had not yet decided what we should be. We had not even troubled ourselves at all on this head. Our little society had sown the seeds of this happy indifference in our souls, and for it alone we were prepared to celebrate the anniversary of its foundation with hearty gratitude. I have already pointed out, I think, that in the eyes of the present age, which is so intolerant of anything that is not useful, such purposelessness, enjoyment of the moment, such a lulling of one's self in the cradle of the present, must seem almost incredible, and at all events blameworthy. How useless we were, and how proud we were of being useless. We used even to quarrel with each other as to which of us should have the glory of being the more useless. We wished to attach no importance to anything, to have strong views about nothing, to aim at nothing. We wanted to take no thought for the morrow, and desired no more than to recline comfortably, like good-for-nothings, on the threshold of the present. And we did. Bless us. That, ladies and gentlemen, was our standpoint then. Absorbed in these reflections, I was just about to give an answer to the question of the future of our educational institutions in the same self-sufficient way, when it gradually dawned upon me that the natural music, coming from the philosopher's bench, had lost its original character and traveled to us in a much more piercing and distinct tone than before. Suddenly, I became aware that I was listening, that I was eavesdropping, and was passionately interested, with both ears keenly alive to every sound. I nudged my friend, who was evidently somewhat tired, and whispered, "Don't fall asleep. There's something for us to learn over there. It applies to us, even though it be not meant for us." For instance, I heard the younger of the two men defending himself with great animation, while the philosopher rebuked him with ever-increasing vehemence. "You are unchanged," he cried to him. "Unfortunately, unchanged, it is quite incomprehensible to me how you can still be the same as you were 7 years ago, when I saw you for the last time and left you with so much misgiving. I fear I must again divest you, however reluctantly, of the skin of modern culture which you have donned meanwhile. And what do I find beneath it? The same immutable, intelligible character, forsooth, according to Kant, but unfortunately the same unchanged intellectual character, too, which may also be necessity, though not a comforting one. I ask myself, to what purpose have I lived as a philosopher, if, possessed as you are of no mean intelligence and a genuine thirst for knowledge, all the years you have spent in my company have left no deeper impression upon you. At present, you are behaving as if you had not even heard the cardinal principle of all culture, which I went to such pains to inculcate upon you during our former intimacy. Tell me, what was that principle?" "I remember," replied the scolded pupil. "You used to say no one would strive to attain culture if he knew how incredibly small the number of really cultured people actually is, and can ever be. And even this number of really cultured people would not be possible if a prodigious multitude, from reasons opposed to their nature and only led on by an alluring delusion, did not devote themselves to education. It were, therefore, a mistake publicly to reveal the ridiculous disproportion between the number of really cultured people and the enormous magnitude of the educational apparatus. Here lies the whole secret of culture, namely, that an innumerable host of men struggle to achieve it, and work hard to that end, ostensibly in their own interest, whereas at bottom it is only in order that it may be possible for the few to attain it." "That is the principle," said the philosopher, "and yet you could so far forget yourself as to believe that you are one of the few? This thought has occurred to you, I can see. That, however, is the result of the worthless character of modern education. The rights of genius are being democratized in order that people may be relieved of the labor of acquiring culture, and the need of it. Everyone wants, if possible, to recline in the shade of the tree planted by genius, and to escape the dreadful necessity of working for him, so that his procreation may be made possible. What? Are you too proud to be a teacher? Do you despise the thronging multitude of learners? Do you speak contemptuously of the teacher's calling? And, aping my mode of life, would you fain live in solitary seclusion, hostilely isolated from that multitude? Do you suppose that you can reach at one bound what I ultimately had to win for myself only after long and determined struggles, in order even to be able to live like a philosopher? And do you not fear that solitude will wreak its vengeance upon you? Just try living the life of a hermit of culture. One must be blessed with overflowing wealth in order to live for the good of all on one's own resources. Extraordinary youngsters! They felt it incumbent upon them to imitate what is precisely most difficult of most high. What is possible only to the master, when they, above all, should know how difficult and dangerous this is, and how many excellent gifts may be ruined by attempting it." "I will conceal nothing from you, sir," the companion replied. "I have heard too much from your lips at odd times, and have been too long in your company to be able to surrender myself entirely to our present system of education and instruction. I am too painfully conscious of the disastrous error and abuses to which you used to call my attention, though I very well know that I am not strong enough to hope for any success were I to struggle ever so valiantly against them. I was overcome by a feeling of general discouragement. My recourse to solitude was neither the result of pride nor arrogance. I would fain describe to you what I take to be the nature of the educational questions now attracting such enormous and pressing attention. It seemed to me that I must recognize two main directions in the forces at work, two seemingly antagonistic tendencies, equally deleterious in their action, and ultimately combining to produce their results: a striving to achieve the greatest possible expansion of education on one hand, and a tendency to minimize and weaken it on the other. The first named would, for various reasons, spread learning among the greatest number of people. The second would compel education to renounce its highest, noblest, and sublimest claims in order to subordinate itself to some other department of life, such as the service of the state. I believe I have already hinted at the quarter in which the cry for the greatest possible expansion of education is most loudly raised,
This expansion belongs to the most beloved of the dogmas of modern political economy. As much knowledge and education as possible, therefore the greatest possible supply and demand, hence, as much happiness as possible. That is the formula. In this case, utility is made the object and goal of education. Utility in the sense of gain. Greatest possible pecuniary gain. In the quarter now under consideration, culture would be defined as that point of vantage from which enables one to keep in the van of one's age, from which one can see all the easiest and best roads to wealth, and with which one controls all the means of communication between men and nations. The purpose of education, according to this scheme, would be to rear the most current men possible. Current being used here in the sense in which it is applied to the coins of the realm. The greater the number of such men, the happier a nation will be. And this precisely is the purpose of our modern educational institutions, to help everyone, as far as his nature will allow, to become current, to develop him so that his particular degree of knowledge and science may yield him the greatest possible amount of happiness and pecuniary gain. Everyone must be able to form some sort of estimate of himself. He must know how much he may reasonably expect from life. The bond between intelligence and property, which this point of view postulates, has almost the force of a moral principle. In this quarter, all culture is loathe which isolates, which sets goals beyond gold and gain, and which requires time. It is customary to dispose of such eccentric tendencies in education as systems of higher egotism, or of immoral culture, Epicureanism. According to the morality reigning here, the demands are quite different. What is required above all is rapid education, so that a money-earning creature may be produced with all speed. There is even a desire to make this education so thorough that a creature may be reared that will be able to earn a great deal of money. Men are allowed only the precise amount of culture which is compatible with the interest of gain, but that amount, at least, is expected from them. In short, mankind has a necessary right to happiness on earth. That is why culture is necessary, but on that account alone.
"I must say something here," said the philosopher. "In the case of view which you have described so clearly, there arises the great and awful danger that at some time or other the great masses may overleap the middle classes, and spring headlong into this earthly bliss. That is what is now called the social question. It might seem to these masses that education for the greatest number of men was only a means to the earthly bliss of the few. The greatest possible expansion of education so enfeebles education that it can no longer confer privileges or inspire respect. The most general form of culture is simply barbarism. But I do not wish to interrupt your discussion."
The companion continued, "There are yet other reasons, besides this beloved economical dogma, for the expansion of education that is being striven after so valiantly everywhere. In some countries, the fear of religious oppression is so general, and the dread of its results so marked, that people in all classes of society long for culture and eagerly absorb those elements of it which are supposed to scatter the religious instincts. Elsewhere, the state, in its turn, strives here and there for its own preservation, after the greatest possible expansion of education, because it always feels strong enough to bring the most determined emancipation resulting from culture under its yoke, and readily approves of everything which tends to extend culture, provided that it be a service to its officials or soldiers, but in the main to itself, in its competition with other nations. In this case, the foundations of a state must be sufficiently broad and firm to constitute a fitting counterpart to the complicated arches of culture which it supports. Just as in the first case, the traces of some former religious tyranny must still be felt for a people to be driven to such desperate remedies. Thus, wherever I hear the masses raise the cry for an expansion of education, I am wont to ask myself whether it is stimulated by a greedy lust of gain and property, by the memory of a former religious persecution, or by the prudent egotism of the state itself. On the other hand, it seems to me that there was yet another tendency, not so clamorous, perhaps, but quite as forcible, which, hailing from various quarters, was animated by a different desire, the desire to minimize and weaken education. In all cultivated circles, people are in the habit of whispering to one another something after this style, that it is a general fact that, owing to the present frantic exploitation of the scholar in the service of his science, his education becomes every day more accidental and more uncertain. For the study of science has been extended to such interminable lengths that he who, though not exceptionally gifted, yet possesses fair abilities, will need to devote himself exclusively to one branch and ignore all others if he ever wish to achieve anything in his work. Should he, then, elevate himself above the herd by means of his specialty, he still remains one of them in regard to all else. That is to say, in regard to all the most important things in life. Thus, a specialist in science gets to resemble nothing so much as a factory workman who spends his whole life in turning one particular screw or handle on a certain instrument or machine, at which occupation he acquires the most consummate skill. In Germany, where we know how to drape such painful facts with the glorious garments of fancy, this narrow specialization on the part of our learned men is even admired, and their even greater deviation from the path of true culture is regarded as a moral phenomenon. Fidelity in small things, dogged faithfulness, become expressions of the highest eulogy, and the lack of culture outside the specialty is flaunted abroad as a sign of noble sufficiency. For centuries, it has been an understood thing that one alluded to scholars alone when one spoke of cultured men, but experience tells us that it would be difficult to find any necessary relation between the two classes today. For at present, the exploitation of a man for the purpose of science is accepted everywhere without the slightest scruple. Who still ventures to ask, what may be the value of a science which consumes its minions in this vampire fashion? The division of labor in science is practically struggling towards the same goal which religions in certain parts of the world are consciously striving after. That is to say, towards the decrease and even the destruction of learning. That, however, which, in the case of certain religions, is a perfectly justifiable aim, both in regard to their origin and their history, can only amount to self-immolation when transferred to the realm of science. In all matters of a general and serious nature, and above all, in regard to the highest philosophical problems, we have now already reached a point at which the scientific man, as such, is no longer allowed to speak. On the other hand, that adhesive and tenacious stratum which has now filled up the interstices between the sciences, journalism, believes it is a mission to fulfill here, and this it does, according to its own particular lights, that is to say, as its name implies, after the fashion of a day laborer. It is precisely in journalism that the two tendencies combine and become one. The expansion and the diminution of education here join hands. The newspaper actually steps into the place of culture, and he who, even as a scholar, wishes to voice any claim for education must avail himself of this vicious stratum of communication which cements the seams between all forms of life, all classes, all arts, and all sciences, and which is as firm and reliable as newspaper is. In the newspaper, the peculiar educational aims of the present culminate, just as the journalist, the servant of the moment, has stepped into the place of the genius, of the leader for all time, of the deliverer from the tyranny of the moment. Now, tell me, distinguished master, what hopes could I still have in a struggle against the general topsy-turvification of all genuine aims for education? With what courage can I, a single teacher, step forward, when I know that the moment any seeds of real culture are sown, they will be mercilessly crushed by the ruler of this pseudo-culture? Imagine how useless the most energetic work on the part of the individual teacher must be, who would fain lead a pupil back into the distant and evasive Hellenic world and to the real home of culture, when in less than an hour that same pupil will have a recourse to a newspaper, the latest novel, or one of those learned books, the very style of which already bears the revolting impress of modern barbaric culture. "Now silence a minute," interjected the philosopher, in a strong and sympathetic voice. "I understand you now, and ought never to have spoken so crossly to you. You are altogether right, save in your despair. I shall now proceed to say a few words of consolation." Recording by Aaron Rivera. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.